sure that that's taken care of. Right. If there are no further questions at this point, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to open the floor. Whenever you're ready.
Am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, just give me a second. Let me set up my timer.
For sure.
Permission. Can I start?
Yep, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so let's start this debate by understanding what we mean by the government halting certain projects, right? So we'd like to contextualize this by saying that we're not saying that the government should stop those AI projects altogether. We're not saying that the government shouldn't be in that the government shouldn't be in favor of those projects. We're not saying that the government should necessarily have this very negative stance towards certain AI projects. But what we're saying is that there needs to be a stop before it gets to a point where the government can control it or can control the consequences of these projects, right? Why is this necessary? We're going to break it down to you in our argument in two ways. The first one is the model argument, right? And the second one is the argument of uncertainty versus certainty. So what we mean is that take the example of artificial intelligence being something that, as of current, we don't know the harms of. We don't understand fully what are the risks that it poses, right? And a good analogy for this would be take the example of the nuclear bomb, right? So when the US was the first to test the nuclear bombs, the consequences were something that we weren't entirely aware of. But what happened retrospectively was that the entire world came together. They regretted what happened. They realized that this was much more far-fetched than anything they could have imagined and anything that they could have foreseen. And then retrospectively, they all came to the same table and they said, hey, we need to figure out a way to not do this in the future. We have this huge risk in our hands. Everyone is aware of it. But what are ways that we can make sure that we're not going to be exposing the world to this in the future, right? Similarly, we think that it's important that up until we understand the risks that are associated with AI, we come together internationally and we set up a body that understands that has a lot of stakeholders involved, right? It has people of different countries, it has researchers, it has scientists, it has people that are proficient in that specific field to understand what are the harms that are posed with AI, right? Why? Because number one, understand this. There's a moral argument to take precautions, right? What this means is that if we do not understand as of currently what are the harms associated with AI, it is better and it takes moral precedence for us to not go ahead with a certain project unless we understand the harms associated with it, right? Or unless the even if we don't have conclusive evidence of saying, let's say there's certain harms to it or that there are particular advantages to it, you can't go ahead with a project unless you fully understand the scope of it and unless you understand what are the overarching consequences that it's going to be having, right? And also because extending that moral argument, it infringes upon a lot of aspects of the entire world. How so? So it's something that particularly affects people, right? Like it affects our human connections, it affects our lives, and we're essentially trying to better our lives with the generation of complex like technology and whatnot. However, when at the same time we're using data from our lives, when we're using data from corporations, and when we're essentially like feeding it information that is about ourselves, we need to understand that the people who are working on these projects can have certain biases, right? So we can't be entirely sure what the information that is being fed to them is entirely objective, or that it doesn't have certain biases coming from those people who are generating these programs, right? So when a situation like that arises, we know that there's a fundamental moral principle that asserts that we need take a step back, and we need to understand that we first need to figure out a way to understand what is going on, how are we going to mitigate that subjectivity, and how are we going to make sure that the information that we're feeding this model is not biased, is not something that is discriminatory towards certain groups, because like a group with certain with more authority is able to influence it in a certain way, and then later down the lines, when generations are using it, they're using the same information, and it's sort of creating this dependency where they're relying on certain information that is being fed to them, yet there's an influence to that information that, it's like a never-ending cycle of perpetuating biases and discrimination instead of using your own objective, your own your own understanding of what is right and what is wrong, right? Next comes the argument of certainty and uncertainty. This is very important to understand, because realize this: as of the status quo, we know that we have certain we can predict that there are certain harms associated with this project. However, we know that if we take it further in the future, we can be sure that there will be certain things that will be out of our hands, right? As of current, we have the decision, we have the autonomy to make sure that it doesn't get to that extent. Even if there are certain benefits associated with that project, it doesn't matter whatever those benefits are, because we understand that the harms associated with it are much more complex and much more overarching than any benefits that you can produce, be it in the field of corporations, be it in the field of health, be it in the field of any single aspect of human life. You need to understand that unless we are uncertain of the harms that are associated with a certain thing, we can't take it forward unless all of us come together, like I said, to understand to understand how we're going to be mitigating those effects. Now, what do these harms look like? Let's take a more nuanced approach to it. So those harms can affect people in not only the field of economics, because let's say that people start using GPT-4 to predict stock market crashes, or predicting what happens tomorrow in the scope of the stock market, right? We understand that because the information that is fed to that model is based on data that has happened in the past, it can't accurately predict things in the future, and thus it's going to give you biased information. It's going to give you information that is influenced by the past, and it's not going to give you a very accurate assumption of the future. Yet people are going to be dependent on it because they believe that it's this crazy thing that has more information than us. It's going to have a lot more information than we will ever do, and they're going to start relying on it and create this mechanism where it's not going to necessarily help them, but lead to situations where it's going to create a much bigger catastrophe than if, let's say, we halt the project, we say, hey, let's understand what's the issue at hand. Let's understand how we can mitigate that subjectivity, how we can mitigate the risks associated with it, how we can reduce the discrimination, the bias, the issues ranging from people's faces being plastered on things they don't want to, the widespread subdivisions of AI that are going into really harmful things, let's say I'm sorry, I didn't keep a check of the chat. I'll take a question if there is one.
Ma'am, the whole point of experiments into giant AI is to figure out how they will react in normal human society. Why do you want to stop or halt the experimentation phase?
We think that it's important to halt that phase because the experiment can lead to very negative consequences, right? So even if the experiment has it has the opportunity to create very good results for you, you can't just go ahead with the process without realizing what the impacts are. We think that the impacts of a certain thing are much more important than just going ahead with a project just for the sake of it. With that, I'm going to conclude my debate. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Leader of opposition, whenever you're ready, you have the floor.
Daniel, can we have a minute? Simir's gone to the bathroom.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Also good. Bingo.
Hello, guys. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
All right, perfect. Just give me a minute.
Sure.
All right, beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think there are a number of fallacies within opening government skills, right? Number one, they're assuming that the people or the companies who are developing or investing within giant AI experiments are people who know jack shit about AI. We don't concede to that, right? We feel people or companies who are developing or investing within giant AI experiments have proper research and development teams. They've been at it for at least decades, right? People like us just found out about this a few months ago, but people who've been developing AI have been doing so for 10 or 20 years, which means that they're very well aware of the risks and opportunities that come with AI. So to assume that there is absolutely no knowledge or awareness about the types of risks that AI poses is a very fallacious argument. Two, you also need to realize that all of these AI, including ChatGPT, was rolled out on a very small scale initially, right? That was to say that they were experimenting with the issue that ChatGPT was facing, the drawbacks that ChatGPT had, or anything that needed to be developed further. So I remember initially ChatGPT only allowed for 100 users, and now it has expanded its server, expanded its base to allow for more users, right? Which means that the experimental phase, allows these individuals or allows these companies to figure out the issues within AI, to figure out where they're lacking within AI, to figure out where AI maybe is not giving accurate results or is slightly biased, and then improve those. If you put a halt on experiments right now, that means that you're not going to be able to develop this AI. And here's something that's very, very important for the government bench to understand today. We're talking about giant AI experiments here, right? Part of experiments is to understand or to carry out risk assessment. To assume that these companies have not already done so is just unfair. But B, you need to understand that if you if you halt investment within giant AI experiments, you automatically halt the investment that goes into risk assessment as well, because that risk assessment requires you to have large amounts of data. That risk assessment requires you, at least in some form of shape, to roll out these AI experiments to the public, to analyze or to get feedback. No one or no investor or no company will be willing to do this, or will be even willing to do risk assessment if you know that you're not going to carry on with AI experiments to begin with, right? So to assume that AI experiments to assume that risk assessment can happen without you rolling out AI experiments or without you investing within AI experiments is a wrong argument to begin with. The third thing, this idea of biases, right? Number one, it's a completely uncomparative argument, right? I don't know how humans or individuals, when we're predicting data or when we're giving out information, we're not biased at all, right? I feel if anything, humans are much more biased, and it's much more difficult to eliminate these biases from human beings because of the type of socialization and the historical patterns that we go through. In fact, it's much easier. It's much easier to eliminate it's much easier to eliminate those biases from AI, and also those can be eliminated only if you invest heavily within AI, right? Lastly, this idea of 100% accuracy. Once again, a wishy-washy argument. We don't know why humans are more accurate. We also need to tell you that AI never claims itself to be 100% accurate, right? There needs to be some sort of verification. The only way you figure all of these things out, and we're not saying that the risks or drawbacks don't exist, the only way you figure all of this out is if you continue experimenting with AI. We still don't know what exact kind of risks are associated. We still don't know how long is this halt going to be for. We still don't know what the investors are going to do in this halt. world, and we still don't know why investors will be willing to invest within the risk assessment projects if they have a fear that AI might not be rolled out. I will take a POI from CG at this point. If you guys don't have one, then OG. Okay, CG I think doesn't have an. OG, yeah, Mariam.
Sir, the issue isn't about the programmers knowing about the issue, knowing about AI. It's about how can you ensure that government will keep up measures to ensure that it doesn't lead to things like Zuckerberg asking questions like, "Will it follow me to the washroom?"
Okay, so firstly, I don't know why governments don't have an incentive to do that, right? Because the first thing that you need to understand is that the governments also are playing a paternalistic role over here, where their main concern is about the welfare of the people. Now, that welfare comes in two forms. A, you recognize or you realize that the more you innovate and the more you invent, the more kind of benefits you get, the more accessible AI becomes for people, the cheaper it becomes. That automatically means A, government is likely to play a role, or government is likely to ensure regulations over here so that the benefit that can be accessed by the people is maximized, right? So that's number one. Number two, a lot of governments themselves are investing, right? A lot of private companies themselves are investing billions of dollars within AI investment. They have to save face. They have an incentive. The governments have an incentive for their voter bases. Companies have their incentives for their profit maximization, which means both of them collectively have an incentive to make sure that some sort of regulations exist within AI, and we're not completely working without any and all sorts of regulations. There's a few things that you need to understand in our positive over here. Number one, the slight historical context, right? When the Industrial Revolution came about, people started crying about it in the exact same way. Hey, we're going to lose out our jobs. This Industrial Revolution is going to take over the world. There's no risk assessment that's happening. Then when technology started to be rolled out, when you had phones and when you had computers, the same kind of jump scare happened again. Oh, hey, phones are going to rule the world. We're going to lose our jobs, etc., etc. The more you evolve as a society, this backlash definitely come in. But if you analyze your society historically, you have to realize that overall poverty rates have gone down. We as a society, collectively as a global society, have increased our efficiency levels significantly, which means that AI is still is literally a step in the same direction, right? Yes, the scale is much bigger. It's also much scarier because it's much bigger. But at the same time, you have to realize that the innovation is happening within the 21st century, where you already have a lot of technology that's available. So if you take a historical context, it's literally a step in the same direction. The scare is just the same kind of scare that's been happening for a long period of time. You halt experiments within AI right now, it will become impossible for you to develop because billions are being rolled into it. Investors will lose out. Companies will stop wanting to invest. A few things about the benefits of AI that exist, right? Number one, you have to understand that AI is bringing about a lot of medicinal benefits, right? So for example, things like patient diagnosis are coming up to about, like, there's almost 95% accuracy that's being reported in patient diagnosis and blood samples, right? That is a huge amount of accuracy that if you halt giant AI experiments right now, it's the people who lose out on that, right? And your government is primarily responsible to the people, which means that the stakeholders that's the people that lose out. If you halt the investment within giant AI experiments, the accessibility of AI is something that decreases. When the accessibility decreases, it no longer ceases to remain, it no longer remains cheap. The benefit about investing heavily within AI right now is that when you invest heavily, it becomes cheaper, it becomes more accessible, more people can benefit out of it. AI can help people in doing mundane tasks. This means human beings can spend their time in more creative tasks. They can spend their time elsewhere. So things like course design, course curriculum, things like these is something that the AI can do very well. Lastly, there's also jobs being created with AI. So things like prompt generation jobs are happening, AI development, AI management, right? Things that have been happening for a long time with technology are already happening, which is why I feel that AI is providing a lot of benefits. If you stop investment in AI right now, you halt or decrease the investor confidence and lose out on all the benefits that AI can potentially give you. Remember, this is an experimental phase. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Deputy Prime Minister, whenever you're ready.
I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. The 2016 US presidential elections were one that were affected by a large variety of misinformation campaigns. The idea that Cambridge Analytica harvested user voter data from social media ahead of the 2016 elections and manipulated the decision making of those very same individuals. It's all the more worse when you have highly accessible AI applications and AI platforms that have the ability to amplify the amount of misinformation present and how that can lead to undemocratic procedures. The fact that these technologies are available to the highest bidder is all the reason to stop. But before I move on to my positive argumentation, a couple of ideas that opening opposition threw right at us. So they have this one brilliant idea. They're like, it's been happening for so long, so it's probably very safe. First response, the creator of OpenAI himself claimed that beyond a certain point, GPT-4 was developing itself. When you reach a certain point where AI is not under human control, it has the potential to start teaching itself and learning far more using machine learning, the probability of it not being held accountable and the idea that those very same risk assessments that human beings are creating is no longer true. Because they no longer exert control over these AI applications. The second idea is that it is a failure on OO's part. Their characterization of corporations that create AI apps is that these applications these platforms are funded by billionaires, backed by them. They've been existing for more than 30, 40 years, and they're completely reliable. But they fail to acknowledge that a large variety of artificial intelligence apps are open source. And so platforms like ChatGPT itself are open source and can be copied and edited to create more apps, which is why they are in comparative far more to proliferate, and why at present we have thousands of artificial intelligence platforms across the world. And these have resulted in the creation of platforms like Chaos GPT, which has threatened to take over the world, which has showed and demonstrated the idea that AI could be capable of purposefully carrying out misinformation campaigns in of itself. The second idea, they said, well, if there's bias, you can improve it by experimentation. And also humans are more biased. The first response, right, and who makes the programs that we're condemning? Because in a large variety of circumstances, the very same individuals that create these apps follow a very myopic range of industry regulations. This industry, being relatively new, has had very few amounts of regulations that prevents how and why these technologies are being used. As a result, these technologies proliferate, and the purpose behind which they're created vary and aren't under the scrutiny of public organizations and body. A very critical issue then is that the rate at which technology is progressing is far outpacing the ability for us to legislate it. When that happens, it's far more harder for you to keep them accountable at a point where AI is essentially out of control. The second idea about bias. Who's to say that the removal of bias itself is replacing it with another bias? That in of itself is something that opening opposition assumed that, well, okay, humans are wrong. We can ensure that there is a perfectly fine way to create a very impartial artificial intelligence platform. When it's clearly so that even applications like that ChatGPT that only search off of the internet, have no opinion of themselves, can become opinionated if you manipulate them to answer in a certain manner. What that does is that it does end up creating echo chambers, which leads to undemocratic discourse when individuals are forced to only listen to what they believe in and not what others believe in. The idea that this in of itself can lead to manipulation is a large harm in of itself. They said the third idea they talked about was that, well, humans are wrong too sometimes. And we're going to completely ignore the fact that humans are the very same people who create these artificial intelligence platforms. One response. The entire idea behind this is that you can hold humans accountable because there are ways for you to track them using their digital footprints by their IP addresses. The idea is that AI itself cannot be held accountable because it does not exist in a physical form. it is not. It is very difficult to differentiate it from other users on the internet. And as a whole, the entire accountability frameworks that you have to hold humans accountable don't exist for AI in of itself, which means the harms that they carry out go unmitigated. The fourth idea is the idea of it being a public good and it doing great stuff for people through patient diagnosis and blood samples, and the idea that it's the people who lose out when we ban such things. The first response: this is exclusively an advantage in the developed world, where alternatives themselves are already subsidized by governments in Europe and are already accessible. But what is critically problematic is how this disproportionately harms developing countries. And this brings me to my first line of argument: harms to democracy. The 2016 US presidential elections were considered to be undemocratic as Cambridge Analytica harvested voter data from social media ahead of the 2016 elections, manipulating voter choice on fringe issues and using misinformation as a premise for decision-making, which led to a very undemocratic outcome. The issue is that AI amplifies its potential for misuse to create undemocratic outcomes for three reasons. The first reason: using technologies like deepfakes, which allow individuals to doctor information however they wish to, and by using individuals in power to propagate those ideas through digital media. The second reason is that these technologies keep improving, both because of profit incentive on part of AI corporations and labs, and also because of machine learning itself. And the third reason is asymmetry is the idea of asymmetry in technological development across the world. The idea that because there is a lower development of technological industries in the developing world, you have far less technological literacy within those areas, which means even though everyone has a smartphone and is connected to the internet, they lack the literacy to differentiate between information and misinformation. The issue then is that the line between misinformation and information has been blurred to the extent that it is very hard to differentiate between both when you have deep fakes and bot accounts creating misinformation campaigns. This is accompanied with asymmetrical technological illiteracy, making developing countries more susceptible to external threats like election tampering and misinformation. The second idea is that these factor into decision-making. Individuals will make decisions at a point of information failure, which leads to undemocratic outcomes. The first impact is that it makes it far more easier for countries to interfere in the elections of smaller developing countries, which is a far more cheaper and accessible and clandestine ways to manipulate elections. The second way is that this affects governing systems in developing countries, worsening the development trap and decreasing the probability of countries from escaping the shackles of underdevelopment. My second line of argument is the idea of AI and privacy, where you have stuff like pornography, where you have stuff like pornography that is individualized, where individuals' pictures are taken and inserted into pornographic media, which has led to things like bullying, which has led to things like harassment, and is oftentimes unmitigated. With the reasons that we're the side that champions democracy, with the reasons that we're the side that undisputedly targets undisputedly takes into account the idea of a technological asymmetry across the world, we believe AI should be halted altogether. Very proud of those.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech. This meeting is about to end, so let me just send another link in the WhatsApp group. So I'll end this meeting, I'll send another link. Go. Okay, I see CG, I see CO, I see OG, and I see OO. I don't see the other two judges. Actually, I see Shamir. So just waiting for a Zair. Okay. Okay, I see you there as well. Okay, I think everyone is here. So yeah, DLO whenever you're ready.
Am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
एक second, yeah, sorry.
Say.
मुझे ना डबल क्लिक क्या करना है, मुझे डबल क्लिक करता है वो इसका नहीं होगा। Okay. All right. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before anything, I'd like to say that we are really hoping for a POI from CG because we want to know what their case is, because we think OG has definitely lost his debate. All right. I'll tell you why. First of all, we think there's a blatant case shift between OG1 and OG2, right? So OG1's over here extremely hopeful, saying, okay, like, we like AI, we think they have a lot of potential. However, we think there's some risk assessment that needs to be done before we launch it. And hence we want to put a halt on it. OG2, on the other hand, goes full Skynet on us, right? They're like, dude, like, this is the end of modern society. Democracy is going to stop functioning. This is equivalent to a nuclear bomb. I mean, okay, if you say so. But the reality is that modern AI technology has been in development for a very, very long time. And the way experimental phases work is that you launch it on a small scale, see how it functions, see how it operates. Because the issue that OG2 pointed out were not issues with malfunctions and bugs and unexpected or untested technology. They have an issue with the way AI itself works. For example, the fact that it's easily accessible. For example, the fact that it's open source AI. For them, the fact that it's teaching itself. If that is their issue, sir, why not just ban AI entirely? Why even put a halt on the experimental phase as a whole? So we don't really see what opening government really wants from this debate. That's the first thing. Secondly, notice there's a contradiction in their case as well. At one point in time, one of their major argumentations is that bias is a huge issue, and if you don't do away with the bias, the technology is not going to work. At the same time, they also admitted to saying that ChatGPT-4 is inherently self-learning and only uses individuals' data to grow and expand. If that is truly the case where AI is self-learning, if the bias does exist, it will be minimalistic at best. But number two, we already said, and by the way, the straw man is over here. We said that, look, even if bias does exist, it is easier to code out bias into an AI system rather than having a human being relearn themselves. Most corporations, most industries, most politicians have their own biases. We still listen to them, and we still have society function based on something of that sort. Number two, we also said that, look, most of these big deal companies have to save face and have an incentive to yield out good products. That automatically means they have an incentive to mitigate and control biases, right? So we don't really see where they're going over here. But lastly, on the issue of bias, we say that AI, if it truly is self-learning, and it hopefully will be in the future, that automatically means that if you do have biases due to one particular population, one particular demographic, that's countered by the information that's input into the system due to other individuals. If anything, there's counterbalancing or cross-checking of bias. The case, and this was very fundamental into our case. We said experimental phase and the whole start of the AI system requires big data. That's how you experiment and see how the AI reacts to inputs from the user and inputs or informations from individuals, corporations, companies, websites, etc., etc. That automatically means that if you want to stop the AI or halt it, you have to kill it off in the experimental phase. So we don't really know what they want. At one point in time, they want to have risk assessment, but that's done through experimenting with the AI because it's self-learning. You cannot just predict what's going to happen in the future because you don't know how the AI is going to react. You need to give it some input, and that is done through small-scale experiments that ChatGPT has already done. But notice how we already said in 001 that this is not new. When ChatGPT was released, they did it on a small scale, which is what they're planning on doing with ChatGPT-4 as well, where we had these small, I would say pilot studies and see how the AI evolves and reacts. Thank you, CG1. Please go ahead.
What is the incentive to improve this bias?
What are you saying? Because human beings don't want to have faulty, bias, and inaccurate data. That's literally the way these AIs function. You want to improve accuracy, you want to improve precision, you want to generate data that's generally more helpful to you. People, if the bias is such a big problem, obviously people would not want to go for it. And considering the fact we're living in a very Western left woke world, individuals will be very, very upset if you have AI that's saying racist or faulty or biased stuff. But that's the whole point, right? If consumers do not want to have biased data, companies have an incentive to react to that information and move on, so on and so forth. So we don't really see the point of this. We don't really see the point of this. And if that is really the case, if companies have no incentive to remove or halt the bias, why even just halt the progress? Just ban the AI entirely. We don't really see your argumentation or your case at all. At one point in time, you're saying it's a fundamental issue within the AI and all human beings are inherently problematic. They're never going to fix AI. Why halt its progress? Why not just ban it? We don't really see your argumentation or your case. I really hope that's not your case, because definitely this debate will be easy for us then. Couple of things that we talked about in 001 that were left unrefuted. Couple of things. Number one, we said that, look, the evolution of technology and the open sourcing of AI automatically means that AI becomes more accessible. Notice we said and characterize this as huge benefits. For 6 months or for however long you want to, because they never give us a time frame that you want to halt AI in, that automatically means those 6-7 months could potentially be used to make corporations, hospitals, schools more efficient. These are pragmatic benefits that are on a comparative way much more heavily than small issues of bias and inaccuracy that AI already claims that has, and that people can make an effort to. Number two, we say that if your argumentation literally is that AI has a potential for misuse and harm democracy, we say, panel, Google has that same potential. Any person with malicious intent can use anything in the world to create harm or cause harm to other individuals. The solution is not to ban the product or ban it entirely, but the solution is to make regulations. Regulations already exist for the misuse of AI for human beings. A human being cannot say that I did this because the AI told me to do so. Disclaimers already exist that you are acting on your own accord, and AIs are not 100% perfect. So you cannot claim that argument in the legal system anymore. We say then that in general, AI has a lot of benefits to modern companies, modern hospitals, and modern ways of technology, because society today works on data analysis. That means we want to collect lots of data and process it to become more efficient and create technologies or create systems or mechanisms that are generally helpful to the human population. What does this look like? Number one, things like medicinal analysis, things like virus detection, things like bacteria detection, things like, just looking at people's blood scans, like x-rays and blood tests, right? And figuring out how sick they are. This drastically alleviates the burdens on hospitals and drastically allows them to refinance the way they're operating. This automatically means more hospital beds, better and more efficient scans. That means people's lives are saved. It's a big benefit on opening opposition that is unrefuted by CG and OG, hopefully. But also we say that in general, you're also allowing them to skip out on more mundane tasks. Notice how in the vast majority of cases, most AIs can only do things that human beings can do, albeit more efficiently. Things like making a painting, things like looking at big data and figuring out trends, etc., etc. That automatically means that by the allowance of and the ease of use of AIs automatically allows us to have more information and just have a more availability to focus on more creative and more innovative tasks. That's generally a big deal, because more innovation and more innovation and more technology just generally means that human beings are better off. You can have more better technology, more innovation, and overall improve society and make society a better place. These are huge benefits that on a comparative were left unrefuted by OG, and we really hope CG gives us a reply. Having said that, please vote for opening opposition.
Okay, I thank the speaker for that speech. Member of government, you have the floor.
Yo, just give me like 1 second. I'm pulling up my clock thing.
Sure, take your time.
All right, I am currently ready. And I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. This has been an interesting debate so far. I feel like OG is winning over OO. I'll just recap what OG did. First, they said we don't know what they're going to do with AIs. It's like nukes. And second, they said there are going to be undemocratic outcomes through deepfakes. Two decent arguments. OO then says that, tech giants know the risks and whatnot. And secondly, there are huge benefits, which is just diagnosis. I'll deal with these things. The first thing I want to do is categorize and characterize tech giants. This will also deal with OO's material. So firstly, in framing what a tech giant is and what they do, they say tech giants have been experimenting for 10 years. They know their things. The problem is that even if they're experimenting, they don't have an incentive to actually improve on these things. Then Shajil kind of says to this, they want better, why do they want better data? I don't know. There's no accountability that is going to be held against, for instance, Tesla, if they come out with an AI detector that categorizes women to have mania or madness more than men. or something along those lines. And there is, like, because you're not exactly paying for OpenAI to begin with, also in this particular circumstance. And even if you are, like, you'll just bias it in favor of the rich. And if, for instance, there is an anti-poor sort of bias that the machine has, that can just kind of go away. And the second thing they say over here with regards to tech giants is that, you can regulate these guys. They have an incentive to not look bad in the public eye. They control the public eye. OG has already done a decent job at showing you deep fakes and how they're actually going to improve, worsen political outcomes. And as a consequence, it is very possible that tech giants just control the public eye to say that OpenAI is great and it's never harmed anyone in its entire life, right? So in that sense, tech giants can be pretty evil if they want to be. This is going to be my major contribution for this debate and what CG is going to bring in extension. The moral case for why the government should try to halt AI to begin with. Why is this an important argument? First of all, this is an important argument because even if you're not that successful at being able to stop AI in the future, or like there's a black market, it's not that good of a definition, whatnot, you have a moralistic responsibility to do so. Secondly, this is a really important argument because this specifically deals with accountability and how you can actually improve AI. And going into that, I'm going to discuss 3 points. The first of which is with regards to the problems for minorities. They say it's easier to code out of a system the bias that is going to be against minorities than to teach a human. There is no incentive to do the coding out of the system. The incentive for humans to not be racist, sexist, etc. is the law. But like you can't exactly hold a machine, for instance, reliable if they misdiagnose you. This also deals with their only benefit, which is diagnosis, right? So you go to an OpenAI detector and they diagnose you, for instance, with the mental health problem of having mania and you're a woman. And the DSM, for instance, is the data that they used for this OpenAI and they, conducted experiments on it, whatnot, and so forth. In this circumstance, this OpenAI doctor, etc., is never going to go to jail. It's never going to exactly improve upon their circumstance because they've just misdiagnosed you. There's no way to like actually improve upon that. How do you give it feedback? Is there possibility for somebody who's been diagnosed with diagnosed with mania to actually give you feedback and tell you that you're wrong when you're the machine to begin with? So even though it might be easier to code out of a system than to teach a human, the human has more incentive to learn than the machine does in the first place because the human might go to jail if they don't learn. So this is the problem for minorities, right? Beyond this, why is it likely that there's going to be a problem for minorities? 2 specific problems, and I want to frame this like the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution did bring like lower poverty levels overall, but it also like brought slavery. It also brought colonialism with it. There were people that were in the transitionary period or that were, funding, or not exactly funding, but like, sourcing the benefits that came with the Industrial Revolution. Just like that, there are going to be test experiments on women that are going to be going to this AI doctor and that are now going to be diagnosed with mania. So even though in the future, maybe there's some benefit, these people right now are being harmed, and that's like a bigger sort of way out, right? Again, this is analogous to the Industrial Revolution bringing slavery alongside of it, even if it did bring the mobile phone and better doctors later. This should not come at the cost of people unconsensually getting into huge amounts of problem. Second sort of line of analysis over here, the stats right now that we have are broadly racist. And the reason for that is data collection historically has kind of been racist. Modern AI has been around for like maybe 10 years, by the way. Like, I don't know what this history of data that they're trying to talk about is, but also this data has so far been racist in the sense that for the longest time, Black people weren't allowed to vote, so on and so forth. There have been more crime inside of these areas, which then leads to the problem of, for instance, if you have a policing system that's tied to the AI, right? It's likely to have racial bias because like black areas, for instance, like Harlem, for instance, are just going to have higher crime rates. So now if you have an AI suggesting where you should deploy more police force, they're going to deploy more police force in Harlem, right? And how do you exactly hold the AI exactly responsible for that? Instead, if there's like a police chief inside of Harlem that's deploying more policemen over there, even though it's not working, or even though there's like problems that are happening because of it, that's never exactly going to happen. Their self-correcting mechanism requires a feedback loop, the feedback for which I don't know where it's going to exactly come from. So the only benefit they exactly have for minorities is gone. And once you count that the problem for minorities, the moral case is really strong. 2 more points. Even if there is no problem for minorities, this is undemocratic to do. OG's argument is it will lead to undemocratic outcomes. Our argument is this is undemocratic currently. So tech giants are running the development of AI. They control what source data is used, what use cases it's given to, and the, things like the price and the availability, so on and so forth. As a consequence, tech giants are running where this thing goes. We just want the government to be able to control where it exactly going, right? Again, this is analogous to the industrial revolution, where the state or the isn't exactly running what's going to happen. It's EIC. It's like these private corporations that are controlling what's going to happen inside the future. So why is the government better than tech companies? So broadly, even if you don't like the government, you at least understand that they're by and large like at least democratic. You at least get like a vote inside of what's going to happen to you in the future. So regardless of if you believe there's going to be a benefit or a harm, people should be allowed to choose what is a benefit or a harm to them, because people are the best place to do so. And they're the best place to do so because, there's no objective metric of what a benefit or a harm is. But secondly, because I would rather not have Elon Musk decided. I would rather literally have Imran Khan decided instead. And the last thing that I wanted to talk about over here was with regards to emissions. By the way, like, so AI regards like large amounts of computer networks, large amounts of electricity data, and so forth, right? This requires one, supercomputers, and secondly, a global network of digitization to begin with. This leads to huge amounts of carbon emissions, which have been the problem for AI to begin with, right? You have stopped things that have been really, really bad for emissions before. You have done this with oil. You are trying to do this, with things like natural gas, LNG, and so on and so forth. And you will not do this if you're a tech giant, because it compromises on profit, even if you know that the emissions are really high. So the issue isn't that they don't know, it's that they don't care, and they have no incentive to care. And that's why CG takes this debate. Thank you.
So I thank the speaker for that speech. Member opposition, you have the floor.
So yeah, just a minute.
Sure, take your time.
So starting in 3, 2, 1. With the permission of the respected educators, let's first of all understand these harms or misuse alleged of AI and clear the clutter off of this debate. We have three clarifications that are really important for the government bench to understand. First of all, there's a concession in this house, and this concession was brought by OG1. They can see that a lot of the harms that they are talking about that exist within the AI are potential harms. That means their potentiality is still to be actualized. And that was really countered by opening government's analysis that how experimentation has that safeguards already in place that can counter and identify those potential threats and maybe make alternative mechanisms in order to achieve the benefits of AI without those same potential harms. Secondly, we think even if these harms aren't undoable, even if these harms will not be filtered out in the experimentation procedures because of God knows whatever reason, these harms are easily undoable because of the fact that a lot of data and a lot of code on which these AIs are programmed is an open source code. Like we see in the example of Google, like we see in the example of Microsoft, in ChatGPT, OpenAI, etc., etc. A lot of software developers are already investigating this code and working on it, testing it continuously. And that is why even if somehow AI was to become autonomous in its data collection and its queries, etc., etc., it is undoable. It is not undoable. It can be undone by tweaking its code or whatever because people already know that. Thirdly, and most importantly, the fact that government bench is talking about these harms, that proves that these harms have actually occurred in the world. कि democracy के अंदर there was a lot of misinformation campaign. Now these kind of deep fakes and misinformation campaigns have nothing to do with giant scale AI projects which focus on language learning models. And the fact that these harms are actually around for a long time means these harms have become easily identifiable and easily counterable. There have been AI engines that can identify these kind of AI misinformation campaigns, AI deepfake images, and hence they can be easily counted, and already mechanisms to identify them exist. Now coming to the opposition's case, let's tackle them head on. Their accountability flag argument that somehow AI isn't accountable. उसके अंदर they have two arguments. First is about tech giants. Understand there's a difference between accountability for tech giants and a difference between accountability for AI related theories. Coming to the tech giants argument, they say that somehow tech giants are, you know, they are very dystopian and they somehow have an incentive to control people or whatever. Understand that these tech giants have uh, been in the market for a long time, and the fact that they are consumer oriented automatically places an accountability on them. अगर मैंने अपनी products बेचनी है, तो obviously I have an incentive to continuously improve the products that I have, to continuously improve the quality of data that I have, and to not ostracize a bigger segment of my consumer base, which includes minorities, which includes people like women, people with disabilities, etc., etc. Secondly, even if we were to concede that these tech giants are somehow dystopian, the argument is fully unexclusive to this debate because there are many large corporations in many other sectors as well. So why don't we introduce ban on those corporations as well? We think this isn't a solution, especially considering the lot of potential benefits that the AI has. Thirdly, we'll give you a positive argumentation that how this kind of tech control and the misuse associated with it worsens in the world of the government. Now coming to the experimental procedure argument, they say that somehow these experiments will be conducted on humans and these humans will be affected, and this is morally wrong. We think this is a grossly misrepresented case, a straw man of the experimentation procedures that are, a benchmark in the industry. First of all of the experiments are conducted like on pilot models, etc., etc. We think already experimental procedures do not go this way. First of all, they are tested for their safety, and only then they are deployed at humans. Uh, Secondly, we think even if they have a problem with the experimental procedures, introducing a blanket ban on AI research isn't the solution. Please tell us why do we have to ban the whole experimentation, and why not introduce some check and balance in the experimental procedures to counter this problem? Now coming to our argumentation, we'll take the government bench on its best case. We can see there are some harms. Now we'll give you three arguments that prove why these harms become worse in their model. First of all, we think introducing a blanket ban will lead to monopolization by the existing models, by the existing corporations that exist in the market. Understand that we exist in a context where large language models have already been developed, and now more are in the process of being developed through giant AI research. We have ChatGPT in the language learning, in the content creation domain, we have Adobe Podcast, etc. In the engineering domain, we have eDraw, etc., etc. These existing corporations, if further corporations are barred from entering into this marketplace by banning research, etc., will monopolize the market segment that exists. Now, imagine a world where Microsoft, who is known for its buggy software and data stealing, is the sole provider of language models like ChatGPT. We think all of this potential misuse and all of these harms that are related to misinformation, that are related to data stealing, etc., become amplified in their case. In the case of monopolization, the second impact would be the loss of competition, and ultimately the mechanism that existed for the betterment of these AI models will automatically be lost because monopolies have an incentive to, like they do not have any incentive to introduce betterment into their products. Now that will ultimately create an AI apartheid where monopolies, because of the loss of competition, will not have to price their products according to the demand, according to the market, and only the selected few will be able to afford or access these products. We think hence the argument of exclusivity, which was constantly brought about by OG and our opposition as well, becomes worse in their case. Coming to my second argument, our second idea, we think it will inherently stimulate black markets in AI research or black areas where there's no accountability, where there's no such regulatory mechanisms that are currently in place, and it inherently worsens all of the harms that they were describing. Why is it likely? First, we think black markets or black areas arise whenever there is an overwhelming demand for these kinds of products. In a world where we live, although there has only been 1 year since ChatGPT has been unrolled, there is a lot of demand around these products, and the evidence for it is a lot of products regarding AI productivity, AI has used in math. Secondly, we think in the world we live in, there is a constant loss of productivity because of inflation, because of like dopamine access, etc., etc. This leads to a lot of demand, a sustained demand for these kinds of products. Now that will make the black market stimulation more likely. And secondly, we think in the computer research area, especially एक tradition exist करता है जिसके अंदर जो developers होते हैं वो आगे ही इस तरह के काम करते आ रहे हैं बहुत से बाहर होकर, which is related to computer science research or programming etc. The development of crypto coin हमने कैसे देखा कि government section के बगैर ही वो develop हो गया. इसी the fact that Pirate Bay exists means that computer developers are out there who have the resources, who have the machinery to develop these models without the sanction of governments. Now, imagine a world where there is a booming black market with links to the crime scene in the world. We think all of these harms, all of the blackmailing, all of such kind of activities will be greatly amplified in a world where government exists. Thirdly, we think it will promote concession-seeking behavior on the part of these large tech corporations because of the fact that they have large resources and influence. Whenever there is a blanket ban, we see such kind of trends in corporations. For example, when a blanket ban on imports was introduced in Pakistan, we see large corporations like Nestle meeting with Hagdar to get little concessions, like to open up their LCs for this and that imports. We think these concessions will also come into place whenever there is a blanket ban on AI research, and this concessional behavior seeking will have an incremental effect that resembles ultimately that is like उसका सेम ही इफेक्ट होगा अगर आप चैट जीपीटी खत्म कर देती हो तो उस तरह के 5-6 और मॉडल डेवलप हो जाए, एक आपको प्रोग्रामिंग के बारे में बता रहा हो, एक आपको साइंस के बारे में, एक बायोलॉजी के बारे में बता रहा हो. We think these kinds of harms will then ultimately also exist क्योंकि incremental effect of these small researches will be the same as giant research. Based on all of these arguments, tackling the opening government, tackling the closing government to win.
Yeah, I thank the speaker for that speech. Just give me 1 second. Laptop charging पे लगा दूं मैं. ठीक है, laptop is on charging. I thank the speaker for that speech. Government whip, you have the floor whenever you're ready.
Sure. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to structure this speech along 3 comparatives. Number 1, and firstly, I'm going to focus on the diagonal and tell you why we're clearly winning over OO. Secondly, I'm going to focus on the comparative with our opening bench with OG. And thirdly, briefly touch upon why we're clearly winning over CO. Let's start with the diagonal and why we're winning over OO. And really, in this messy debate, the one really important claim that comes from OO, which their entire case hangs on, is the following. Experimentation of AI leads to identifying errors that can eventually be weeded out because AI models are self-learning and so on. A number of responses to this, and the way I want to frame this is, number 1, tell you why this argument is simply untrue, but B, even in scenarios where it is true, it is far less important than the claims that we brought out at CG1. Firstly, understand that the way AI development works is inherently, and this is a claim that's implicitly been agreed on at opening, is that it is too fast. This is due to 2 reasons. Number 1, there's open source development. So now there are thousands and thousands of apps that are coming on. And number 2, the model of AI, or currently the boom of AI, means that there are unregulated profits. So there are a lot of players that are entering the market very, very easily. Why is this important? This is important for a number of reasons. Number one, when your development and experimentation is so fast and so quick, where you're developing new things and where even things like GPT 3.5 have become outdated just within 3-4 months, this inherently means that you cannot have any regulation. You cannot come to consensus on base guidelines. You cannot come to international consensus on the safety of AI, etc., just because of the fact that you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. You don't know what new technology is going to arise out of this, and you don't know how this is going to develop. We say a simple response to this, that you halt the experimentation in the time being, which could also mean that these apps can still run, for instance, based on the existing data that they have collected, which OO says that is a lot and is enough to make big innovations in healthcare, etc. That is all okay, and that can happen on both sides. So that's really not asymmetric. But what really happens, and what importantly happens, is that when you halt experimentation, there's a room to come to global consensus, there's a room to come to base guidelines, and there's a room to reflect on the data that you've collected and then see where biases exist and how those can be weeded out. Now, coming to Sharjil's response to this in 002 is that AI development is going to happen such that eventually investors and these companies will have an incentive to give good feedback, and also just the incentive of having public criticism, etc., is going to result in no biases. It's going to result in harmless and good technology. Okay, number of things, and I'm going to start with the historical framing of this. AI has been around for a while, as Samir says. In 2016, for instance, there was this huge scandal of AI developed security cameras identifying Black people disproportionately for crimes. We are now in 2023 and those harms still exist. So there's been recent research that suggests that medicinal AI usage has disproportionately misdiagnosed Black people for various reasons. Now, what all of this means is that within the last decade of AI development, which you contextualize as being super good, super valuable, and comes from a place where there is a lot of incentives to develop well, we have not fixed these problems. So currently, AI biases do exist and they haven't been fixed for a while. Now, why does this happen? What are the structural reasons behind this? There are two main reasons over here. Number one is that there is no one to actually give positive feedback in this instance. So for instance, if a woman is misdiagnosed through, let's say there's an AI medicinal procedure and a woman is misdiagnosed, etc., there is not going to be any magical third party that's going to come and that's going to give you a concrete analysis on that diagnosis and say that that diagnosis is wrong for, let's say, sexist or racist reasons, etc. What's going to happen likely, and this is particularly true in developing countries, etc., where these technologies are less likely to be fully developed and they're less likely to be more literacy around these technologies, what's likely to happen is that the woman is going to believe that diagnosis, and hence there's going to be no positive reinforcement of that feedback. To this, if you say that the AI is going to self-learn, etc., the self-learning of the AI also depends on some sort of positive feedback going into the system, for which we say that a government-mandated experimentation halt will mean that we can reflect on these data, so we can reflect on the gaps in these data, and we can actually provide that positive reinforcement feedback that it needs, that in the absence of which will not happen. Secondly, though, I'm also going to say to this that if you don't believe or take any of this, it is also just true that Microsoft and other big corporations, which homogeneously almost control AI development that's currently happening in the modern world, have control over this data. So they can very well just tomorrow make OpenAI not open source, and they can just not choose to tell the public about the kind of problems or the kind of biases that exist within the existing language models and the existing data that they have. I'm going to take O.
You've repeatedly said that human beings have no incentive to improve and reduce biases. We still don't know that if you halt this system, why will that incentive to improve or increase biases exist?
When we stop the system or when we halt experimentation, there's a chance for governments and there's a chance for people to go back to reflect on the current data that's been collected and to see where we can make improvements. If not that, at the very least, there's a room for global consensus. There's a room for some base guidelines being set for the safety, usage, etc. of these technologies, which currently do not exist and are impossible to exist given how fast these technologies develop and change. all of this panel, why is all of this important? There are two reasons. Number one, we've proven why by and large O's argumentation is just not true. It's coming from a factually incorrect place. But B, even if for a minute I concede that what O has said about feedback and about positive reinforcement is true, the comparative and the harm is really simple. You are harming people right now, and Samir and Shajil repeatedly concede to this within the speech. You are harming people right now for an uncertain benefit that you will realize to people later. I think just on the basis of people existing right now, being within these countries and current life being more important than future life, we say that this argument is then far more important and far more impactful. Really quickly, why are we winning over OG? There's going to be just two things I'm going to talk about here. Number one, Shaukat makes a moral argument, which is super important. We say that trying to ban or trying to regulate, AI is important, even if it fails, because it leads to two things. Number one, it leads to these companies actually kind of improving their behavior and in some ways self-censoring themselves, given that there's at least a risk of regulation or at least a risk of an outright ban. And number two, when you talk about AI regulation, etc., when it's more in the public eye through actions like this, you eventually have more public buy-in and you eventually have more public trust that comes in. Therefore, from the government's perspective, trying to do this is extremely important and it is a moral responsibility. Secondly, OG characterizes all its harms as uncertain harms, except in Daniel's speech, where they talk a bit about undemocratic outcomes, etc. Two things to this. Number one, Shaukat has characterized to you certain harms that do exist currently and will continue to exist, and we give structural reasons for that. Number two, to the undemocratic outcomes, we say that the outcomes, while maybe uncertain, again, it is undemocratic to give control over such an important aspect to private entities that have no incentive and actually have the perverse incentive to actually improve these technologies and weed out biases. For how much time do I have? Okay, so just to synthesize really quickly, this debate is really, really simple. We've talked to you about why AI is going to be harmful if it's led to develop currently unregulated. We've told you the benefits of regulation and the need for pausing it currently, and we've characterized you certain harms that will happen currently in the future as opposed to uncertain harms that will happen sometime later. For all of those reasons, vote CG.
Thanks to speaker for that speech. So this meeting is also about to end, so I'm just going to send the last meeting of the day and end this meeting. Okay? All right.